hopefully not least, if last, but we'll see how we go. I'm going to talk about what I see as some of the dangers of being very myopically focused just on bleaching, okay? Now, I want to make it clear here that my comment is not that mass bleaching events are not damaging to reefs. They are hugely damaging to reefs. And David Bellwood clearly stated that the damage can be 10 years down the road, and that damage doesn't necessarily have to be visible, that actually very important and significant damage can be invisible. And to some extent, I want to make the same claim at another level, okay? My goal here is really to look at the argument that corals can adapt through hosting symbionts that have been demonstrated to be thermally tolerant. And this is really the argument that there exists as symbionts, and even that they exist and can infect in high numbers corals, is an argument for the ability for corals to adapt, and from then on, or the argument that coral reefs can be safeguarded in such a way from climate change. Okay, I'm going to offer two arguments. One is a logical argument, and one is a biological argument. So, to begin with logic, I had a past life as a logician. I did my undergraduate in maths and logic. So, I'm just going to present two arguments. If you look at the top one here is a good argument, okay? The bottom one is a bad argument, okay? The bottom one, the final statement might be true, can always be true, but it's not justified by the truth of the two statements that come before it, okay? And I think this is an important point. In science, we like our arguments to be justified, okay? Not to just be potentially true. Any statement can be potentially true, okay? So, when we look at the literature, okay, and we pick up a paper that's on symbionts and corals and bleaching, the introduction makes two very clear cases. Almost every paper does it. The first case is that corals, in fact, autotrophic hermatypic corals, are necessary to coral reefs, okay? The second statement we all make is that to have these corals, we have to have symbionts. Symbionts are necessary to these corals as well, okay? Put those two together, we'll build an environment around them, and what that means is, if we still have a coral reef in that environment, then it automatically follows that our corals are resilient to that environment, and that our symbionts are resilient to that environment, okay? But what I would like you to note is, we don't get this statement, okay? This is driving the wrong way, okay? And if you go back to my logical fallacy, you can see that demonstrating resilient symbionts requires this to be able to pull out resilient reefs at the bottom end of it, okay? Why is this false? This is false, and I hope that every fish biologist in the room sighs a sigh of the relief. Corals are not sufficient for coral reefs. There's a whole lot more that is relevant here. And also, we know that we've got corals off Sydney, but we don't have reefs off Sydney, okay? The latter statement, symbionts are not actually sufficient for corals, okay? That can be stated a different way. Corals are necessary for symbionts. Actually, no, if the adaptive bleaching people would have us, or the infectivity of any symbiont into any host works, because a lot of those hosts aren't actually corals, okay? So, that's my logical argument, okay? We can't go from resilient symbionts to resilient reefs. We can say if we've got resilient reefs, we know we've got resilient corals, but we can't go the other way around. Okay, so I think we need to be careful here. We're scientists, okay? It's possible reefs might be resilient to climate change. Everything's possible, okay? My logic teacher liked to say pigs might fly is possible, okay? But what we need to think is, should inaction be driven by such a possibility? Okay. So now to the biological argument, okay? Unbleached corals are better than bleached corals, okay? Yes, that is true, if By unbleached, you mean having no symbionts, and by bleached, having some. Okay? The problem is that's not the way we use the word. We use unbleached is fewer and, unbleached is more and bleached is fewer. Okay? If you look at a coral, and this is going back to David Bellwood's, everything might look fine. There might be a rich density of symbionts in there, but you don't have the mutualistic relationship unless you've got the handover of energy between one and the other. Okay. So, does bleaching necessarily lead to lower net photosynthesis? Okay, most of us believe that for the most part. I've put a color chart there, that's the pigmentation in a coral, okay? At the bottom here, we've got pigmentation, chlorophyll A, related to density, okay? What I've got on the y-axis is just productivity per surface area. And I hope what you can see is there is no change as we go along that entire scale in this case. This was for Croppa millipora taken from both Lizard Island and Heron Island, okay? The reason is, as chlorophyll reduces, the actual chlorophyll works harder for you. And it doesn't matter in this case whether we use cells or chlorophyll, they're just interchangeable. Okay? So, next question. Does bleaching necessarily increase the propensity for polyp mortality? Okay? I differ when I look at a coral. I see a coral as a mass of polyps. Sometimes they're brought together in an individual that's called a colony, but when those polyps die, it's actually really just losing copy number in many ways, okay? And that copy number can be living on some other colony somewhere else equally well, okay? So if we look at the top clade, yes, D don't bleach in response to temperature, C do bleach in response to temperature, but I think the mortality at the end in the pie charts is something we also need to look at. Actually, in this case, it was possible to die without bleaching. Okay? Betty showed us, there is sometimes, it's not always the case, sometimes we can go to different places in the field, but sometimes clade D does not grow as well as clade C corals. A fifth of the growth rates. And very influential scientists once said in response to this potentially negative impact of having D in the tissues that it wasn't relevant, it didn't really matter. Okay? What I think that fails to appreciate again is the clonal nature of these organisms. Not you or I who die and that's it. Mortality is a loss of certain polyps, okay, which can be compensated by growth. Growth is very important. Okay, as Guillermo has shown, okay? Keppel's 2002, we had a thermal anomaly, 2006, not nearly as bad as 2002. Everything bleached, 95% is the maximum bleaching in the brackets up there. Lots of death, as Guillermo said, but the recovery rate is huge, okay? So mortality is only detrimental insofar as it's not taken care of by growth, okay? So I've thrown some data in here, okay? I've got my clade D millipora here, and I've got my clade C, okay? And we might argue about the numbers and what's happening, but I've just taken what I've demonstrated, -20 mortality. It looked the same for both on the data I started out this talk with, okay? Growth, I had 1/5 faster, 5 times faster in one case than the other. What's the net overall result, okay? Who is the real winner in this context? One has to ask, okay? I think we need to understand this dynamic, just as Betty said, a lot better, okay? These polyps make the calcium carbonate. Vast numbers of these polyps are necessary for all that 3D structure that we want out there. Furthermore, when these polyps die off, they leave a calcium carbonate structure that erodes a lot faster than when the polyps are present. So erosion rates go up as well. So if we look at the world at the moment, irrespective of D or C sitting in the colony, okay, what's the KPI for coral growth rates, okay? Presently, even now, we are annually in the red. Brino et al. Reinforced that one just recently in his paper, okay? What's the prognosis for the future? I don't think the prognosis for the future is very good. There are scenarios where we do stuff about CO2, where we stop using fossil fuels to some extent, and when we stop increasing our population at such a huge rate. There are scenarios in which we do nothing. Notably, only if we act, okay, do we get that nice 2 degrees that most of us are actually quibbling about as to whether corals will be able to cope with it and the system will be able to cope with it. I think the bottom line is, the message is clear. I don't think any of us really believe that the top bracket there is corals are going to survive in. And hence, as I've said this morning, we've got to fight for those scenarios not to follow on now. And I think our quibbles about whether they can adapt or not don't necessarily help that aim. Thank you.